As a dedicated lead engineer, I've provided them with a life of luxury while maintaining a quiet and steady existence for myself. Last Tuesday, they ambushed me in my cramped office to end it all. Between blueprints and spilled coffee, my wife dropped divorce papers on my desk, while my boss leaned against the doorframe, smirking. "You know, Harrison, you should just sign this and disappear quietly," he told me. "Pity only goes so far." I simply took out my pen and smiled. That day, I signed away my house and my retirement, fully aware I had just inherited $510 million and a controlling stake in the exact company my boss ran. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth. Working at Apex Dynamics meant decades of loyalty and hard work to the outside world. But inside that sprawling corporate building, a cold and ruthless calculation permeated every corner. My small engineering office with its fluorescent lights and worn-out chairs became my sanctuary and my prison. I had maintained stellar performance reviews and designed their top-selling products, yet I was always pushed aside by the newer, louder executives. It was exactly 10 in the morning when the fragile piece of my routine was shattered. I was hunched over my drafting table, double-checking the structural load calculations for a new manufacturing component. The heavy wooden door to my office did not just open. It was thrown violently against the wall. I looked up slowly, taking off my reading glasses. Standing in the doorway was Cynthia, my wife of 40 years. She wore a tailored designer coat that I had paid for just last month. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her face was twisted into a cold, hard sneer. The real shock, however, was the man standing right behind her like a bodyguard. It was Gregory Thorne. He was 48 years old, the newly appointed, incredibly arrogant Chief Executive Officer of Apex Dynamics. He was the man who had spent the last 6 months aggressively cutting my department budget and making my daily life miserable. Gregory stood there with his arms crossed tightly over his custom Italian suit. A smug, condescending grin was plastered across his face. He looked at me not like an employee who had given his life to the company, but like a piece of trash he could finally throw away. Cynthia marched forward without a word of greeting. She slammed a thick manila envelope right onto the center of my blueprints, knocking over my morning coffee. The dark liquid pooled across the desk, ruining hours of meticulous work. "I want a divorce, Harrison," she announced. Her voice was piercing, loud enough for anyone walking down the hallway to hear. "I am completely done. I refuse to spend another day in a stagnant marriage with a man who has zero ambition and no future. These are the legal papers. My lawyer expedited them yesterday. I am taking the house. I am taking the cars. And I want 70% of your retirement fund. You are going to sign this document right now, or I will drag you through a humiliating court battle that will leave you with absolutely nothing to your name." I stared at the thick stack of papers. The word divorce was printed boldly in black ink at the top of the page. I looked up from the papers to Cynthia. Her eyes were empty, completely devoid of any warmth or memory of the 4 decades we had spent together. Then I looked at Gregory. He shifted his weight, his grin widening to show his perfectly white teeth. He was thoroughly enjoying this moment. He was savoring the profound humiliation of an older man being discarded by his own wife right in the middle of his workplace. They had clearly planned this ambush together to maximize the shock. They wanted to break me. They expected me to beg to cry or to cause a pathetic scene. As Cynthia continued her loud tirade listing all my perceived failures, complaining about my lack of drive and my refusal to climb the corporate ladder. Her voice slowly faded into a dull background noise. I stopped listening to her insults. My mind detached from the chaotic office and drifted back to a highly secure covert phone call I had received exactly 48 hours prior. It was Sunday morning. I had been sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee when my cell phone rang. The caller ID was restricted. A calm, deeply authoritative voice introduced himself as Victor Cross. He was a senior partner at an elite private wealth management law firm. He asked if I was Harrison Caldwell, the only living brother of Vincent Caldwell. Hearing my brother's name made my chest tighten. Vincent and I had a bitter, terrible falling out over 3 decades ago. Vincent was ruthless, driven purely by the accumulation of wealth and absolute power, while I had chosen a quiet, steady life centered around family. We had completely cut ties. I had not spoken a single word to him in 30 years. Victor Cross informed me that Vincent had passed away silently the previous week from sudden heart failure. Because Vincent never married and had no children, he had spent his final months desperately tracking me down. Victor told me that my brother had built a massive global financial empire, remaining a hidden billionaire, operating through a complex web of anonymous blind trusts. Then Victor delivered the words that completely altered my reality. He told me that I was the sole named heir to Vincent's entire estate. The total verified liquid and asset value was $510 million, but that was not even the most crucial piece of information. Victor explained that Vincent had been aggressively expanding his portfolio right up until his death. Through a massive private equity shell company called V-Core Group, Vincent had quietly purchased distressed debt and majority shares across the technology sector. Just 3 weeks ago, V-Core Group had officially acquired a 60% controlling stake in the parent corporation that owned Apex Dynamics. Sitting in my cramped office, looking at my screaming wife and my arrogant boss, the absolute irony of the universe washed over me in waves. Gregory Thorne thought he was the undisputed king of the world. He thought he could stand in my office, mock my career, and help my wife tear my life apart. But Gregory did not know that 48 hours ago I became the absolute majority owner of his entire company. I owned the expensive leather chair he sat in. I owned the floor he confidently stood on. I owned his entire career. I was his ultimate boss. Cynthia slammed her hand violently on the desk, snapping my attention back to the present moment. "Are you even listening to me, Harrison?" she shrieked. "Sign the papers. You are completely useless to me now. Just sign them and let me get on with my life." Gregory chuckled softly, stepping fully into the room. "Come on, Harrison," he said, his tone dripping with fake pity. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. You are an old relic in a young man's game. Your designs are outdated, and frankly, your presence here is holding my company back. Just sign the divorce papers, take an early quiet retirement, and walk away. It is the best thing for everyone involved." They waited for the breakdown. They braced themselves for the trembling hands, the desperate pleas of an old man losing everything he had worked his entire life to secure. But they received none of that. I felt a strange, freezing calm settle deep in my chest. It was the kind of total clarity that only comes when you realize you hold every single card in a high-stakes game and your opponents are playing completely blind. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger, sorrow, or surprise. I slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. It was a vintage piece, a highly expensive relic that Victor Cross had sent to me via private courier the day before. It had belonged to my brother Vincent. The cool metal felt heavy and powerful in my grip. I pulled the divorce documents toward me, carefully avoiding the spilled coffee. I flipped directly to the very last page. I did not read a single legal clause. I did not check the asset division or the outrageous retirement fund demands. I simply did not care. None of it mattered anymore. With smooth, deliberate strokes, I signed my full name on the dotted line. Cynthia blinked, completely taken aback by my silence. Her mouth parted slightly in confusion. Gregory stopped smiling. His arms dropped to his sides. This was definitely not the reaction they had scripted in their heads. I calmly capped the gold pen and placed it back into my breast pocket. I pushed the signed documents across the wet desk toward Cynthia. Then I slowly stood up. I took my worn winter coat from the rack behind the door. I did not pack up my blueprints. I did not gather my family photos. I did not even take my coffee mug. I looked Cynthia dead in the eyes. Her gaze wavered, suddenly flashing with a hint of uncertainty. Then I looked at Gregory, letting my eyes travel slowly over his expensive suit and his arrogant face. "Goodbye, Cynthia," I said, my voice completely flat and void of any emotion. "Goodbye, Gregory." I walked past them, stepping out into the busy hallway without looking back once. The silence I left behind in that cramped office was absolute and deafening. They stood there holding a piece of paper they thought was the symbol of my total defeat. They thought they had successfully discarded a weak, clueless old man. They thought they had won the ultimate victory. They had absolutely no idea that I had just handed them enough rope to hang themselves, and the real war had not even begun. The brisk autumn air hit my face the moment I stepped out of the Apex Dynamics building. I did not hail a cab. I did not look back at the glass facade where I had spent the last 20 years of my life. Instead, I walked 3 blocks south, blending seamlessly into the midday crowd. To anyone passing by, I was just an ordinary older man in a slightly worn suit, perhaps a retiree heading to a quiet lunch. They had no way of knowing I was walking toward an absolute shift in my existence. My destination was an unmarked brutalist steel structure in the heart of the financial district. There was no corporate logo on the exterior, only a discreet address plaque. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and approached the security desk. Before I could even state my name, a tall man in a dark suit stepped out from the private elevator bank. He guided me into an elevator that required retinal scanning. We ascended in complete silence. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, there were no opulent chandeliers or excessive displays of wealth. The space was purely functional, dominated by polished concrete, reinforced glass, and soundproof walls. This was a place where global power shifted hands in total secrecy. Victor Cross stood waiting at the end of a long corridor. He was a man in his late 50s, sharp, meticulously groomed, and radiating an aura of absolute competence. He extended his hand, his grip firm and strictly professional. "Mr. Caldwell Victor," said his voice low and measured. "Please come with me. We have much to finalize." He led me into a secure conference room. The walls were lined with digital monitors displaying encrypted financial data. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk and handed me a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I opened it. The first page displayed a complex flowchart of international assets, banking routing numbers, and corporate holding structures. "Let us get straight to the point." Victor began tapping a key on his laptop. The screen behind him illuminated. "As of 9 this morning, the entire transition protocol for your late brother has been fully executed. The $510 million have been successfully consolidated and transferred into a newly established, entirely anonymous blind trust. Per our previous discussion, the legal entity is registered as V Core Group." I stared at the screen. The numbers were staggering. $510 million. It was a figure that defied standard comprehension. But I felt no sudden urge to celebrate. I felt no desire to purchase luxury estates or sports cars. My mind was entirely locked onto the tactical reality of the situation. Money at this level was not about comfort. It was about leverage. It was a weapon, and I was ready to wield it. "And Apex Dynamics?" I asked, my voice steady. Victor nodded, pulling up a secondary document on the screen. V Core Group officially holds a 60% controlling stake in the parent conglomerate that owns Apex Dynamics. The acquisition was finalized 3 weeks before your brother passed. The current executive board of Apex, including their chief executive officer Gregory Thorne, operates under the assumption that their majority shareholder is a foreign investment consortium. They have absolutely no idea that V Core Group is a single individual, and they certainly do not know that individual is you. A cold satisfaction settled over me. Gregory Thorne had stood in my cramped office less than an hour ago, grinning like a predator, as he helped my wife tear my life apart. He believed he was the untouchable king of his corporate castle. He believed he held my entire future in the palm of his hand. He was completely oblivious to the fact that I owned the walls around him, the desk he sat at, and the very contract that employed him. I closed the leather portfolio and leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany table. "Victor," I said, my tone shifting into a sharp, commanding cadence. I need to initiate a full-scale covert investigation into Apex Dynamics immediately. Victor raised an eyebrow, picking up a digital stylus. What exactly are we looking for, Mr. Caldwell? I want a team of elite forensic accountants deployed by the end of the day, I instructed. They are to operate entirely in the shadows. I want them to tear apart Gregory Thorne and his financial history since the day he took over as CEO. I want every single ledger, every vendor contract, and every expense report analyzed down to the very last cent. I paused, gathering my thoughts, letting the decades of my engineering experience translate into corporate strategy. I had watched Gregory operate for months. He was arrogant, flashy, and constantly cutting budgets in the most critical departments, while his personal lifestyle expanded exponentially. Men like Gregory did not simply earn their wealth through standard salaries. They took it. They squeezed it from the foundation of the companies they ran. Look for shell companies. I continued speaking with rapid precision. Look for inflated consulting fees, offshore routing, and dummy vendor accounts. He has been aggressively slashing the engineering and manufacturing budgets, citing corporate restructuring. Yet the company revenue has not dropped proportionally. That money is bleeding out somewhere. I want to know exactly where it is going. I want to trace every single drop. Victor typed rapidly on his tablet, his expression entirely focused. A forensic audit of that magnitude conducted covertly will require breaching their internal firewalls without triggering executive alerts. It is complex, but entirely feasible. I have a team of former federal financial investigators on retainer. They specialize in corporate espionage and silent audits. They can be inside the Apex servers by midnight tonight. Do it, I commanded. Money is no object. Pay them whatever it takes to secure undeniable ironclad proof. I want a complete dossier on every single financial move Gregory Thorne has made. And I want to know who his internal accomplices are. Men like him never operate completely alone. They always have a network of enablers. Find them all. Consider it done, Victor said, locking eyes with me. How much time do we have before you plan to reveal your position? I leaned back in my chair, calculating the timeline. Cynthia had filed the divorce papers today. The legal processing time for division of assets was roughly 90 days. She would assume the process was moving forward smoothly. She would be fully believing she had secured a flawless victory. We have exactly 90 days, I stated very coldly. 90 days to map his entire operation, secure the evidence, and prepare the legal framework for a hostile takeover. Until then, V-Corps Group remains a ghost. Gregory Thorne must continue to believe he is running the show. He must feel completely secure in his position. Arrogance breeds carelessness. Let him get comfortable. Let him think he has already won. Victor smiled slightly, slowly closing his silver laptop computer. It is indeed a highly effective strategy, Mr. Harrison Caldwell. You are truly giving them the absolute unbroken illusion of total, unopposed, unyielding control. The transition from Victor Cross and the world of high finance to the gritty reality of my new cover story needed to be absolute. I left the towering glass and steel architecture of the financial district behind and took a bus to the industrial outskirts of the city. I needed to look exactly like the broken, discarded man my wife and my boss believed me to be. I found a dilapidated roadside motel that charged $40 a night. The neon sign outside buzzed with a harsh, flickering red light, and half the letters were burned out. I walked into the cramped lobby, paid in cash from my meager savings, and took the physical metal key to room number 12. The door groaned loudly as I pushed it open. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpeting, and harsh chemical cleaners. The floral bedspread was faded, and water dripped rhythmically from the bathroom faucet. It was a miserable, decaying box. It was exactly what Cynthia expected my new life to look like. I placed my small, battered suitcase on the rickety wooden chair in the corner. I did not unpack. Instead, I slowly sat down on the edge of the stained, sagging mattress. The springs creaked under my weight. In this absolute silence, far removed from the screaming match in my former office and the strategic quiet of the boardroom, The heavy truth of the past year began to crush down on me. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift backward. I needed to dissect the lies. I needed to dismantle the careful illusions they had built around me. For the last 6 months, Cynthia had been actively rewriting the narrative of our 40-year marriage. She had started taking sudden weekend trips, packing her bags every Friday evening, and leaving me alone in our sprawling suburban home. When I first asked her about these frequent absences, she put on a mask of deep dramatic sorrow. She told me she was attending specialized healing yoga retreats. She claimed she needed the spiritual space to cope with the crushing stagnation of our marriage. She would stand in our pristine kitchen holding a cup of organic tea and tell me that my lack of ambition was draining her soul. She said I was too focused on engineering, too rigid, and too blind to her emotional needs. I had believed her. I had swallowed the guilt she carefully fed me. I had even offered to pay for those expensive retreats out of my own declining salary, hoping they would bring her peace. I remembered the way she would return on Sunday nights looking refreshed and vibrant, carrying a lingering scent of expensive wine and a relaxed smile. She told me the meditation was helping her find clarity. Now, sitting in the squalor of room 12, the sheer magnitude of her deception made my blood run cold. She was not meditating. She was not healing. She was spending my money to fund her illicit weekends with Gregory Thorne. She had weaponized my devotion to her, turning my genuine concern into the very mechanism she used to carry out her affair. She painted me as the villain in her grand tragedy, playing the neglected wife to justify her ultimate betrayal. The pieces of the puzzle began snapping together with terrifying precision. Cynthia and her emotional manipulation was only one half of the strategy. The other half was executed entirely by Gregory at Apex Dynamics. About 8 months ago, shortly after Gregory was appointed as the new chief executive officer, the atmosphere in my engineering department shifted dramatically. He called me into his spacious, sunlit office for what he termed a routine performance evaluation. He sat behind his massive desk, steepled his fingers, and spoke to me with a voice dripping in false corporate sympathy. He told me that the company was undergoing a massive, unavoidable corporate restructuring. He claimed the board of directors was demanding immediate budget cuts across all senior staff levels to save the company from impending financial ruin. He targeted my compensation package directly. He slashed my base salary by 40% and stripped away my annual performance bonuses. When I questioned the severity of the cuts, considering my department was the most profitable division in the entire company, Gregory sighed deeply. He told me I was being selfish. He said I needed to be a team player, that older employees had to make sacrifices so the younger generation could keep their jobs. He slowly dismantled my authority, transferring my major projects to junior engineers and moving my workspace from a corner suite to a cramped, windowless office near the supply closet. He humiliated me systematically day after day, masking his targeted cruelty as unavoidable business necessity. I had accepted it because I believed I was protecting my team and my family. I opened my eyes and looked at the peeling wallpaper of the motel room. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was never a sudden lapse in judgment on her part. This was not a spontaneous workplace romance fueled by proximity. It was a coordinated, deeply methodical campaign designed to completely destroy me. Gregory and Cynthia had orchestrated every single move together. Gregory systematically drained my financial resources and professional dignity at work, ensuring I would not have the means to fight a lengthy legal battle. Cynthia simultaneously broke down my emotional defenses at home, creating a false narrative of neglect to justify her inevitable departure. They wanted to strip me of my money, my pride, and my home, leaving me an impoverished, broken old man who would simply fade away into obscurity. They did not just want to end a marriage or force an early retirement. They wanted absolute annihilation. They wanted me to sign those divorce papers in a state of total panic and submission, accepting a life of poverty while they danced away with my hard-earned assets. They believed they had executed the perfect crime. They believed I was too naive, too trusting, and too weak to see the snare before it closed around my neck. I stood up from the creaking mattress and walked over to the small, grimy mirror hanging above the bathroom sink. I stared at my reflection. I saw the gray hair, the lines etched around my eyes by 40 years of relentless labor, the slight stoop in my shoulders. I looked exactly like the victim they had engineered me to be. But behind my eyes, the trusting husband and the loyal employee were entirely dead. In their place stood a man holding a $510 million hammer. I turned away from the mirror. I did not feel sorrow anymore. I did not feel heartbreak or despair. I felt a profound, calculating anticipation. They had spent the last year carefully digging a grave for me. Over the next 90 days, I was going to gladly watch them fall into it. I would ensure their absolute ruin. The silent war had officially begun, and I would not lose. I would finally teach them the true cost of their brutal and relentless greed. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse precisely on time, wearing the same faded suit I had worn to my office the day Cynthia demanded a divorce. My posture was deliberately hunched, my steps slow and shuffling. I looked exactly like a man who had been completely broken by the weight of his failures. Inside the courtroom, Cynthia sat beside her expensive lawyer, dressed in a conservative but elegant gray dress. She was playing the part of the long-suffering, emotionally exhausted wife to absolute perfection. She dabbed at the corners of her dry eyes with a tissue, whispering quietly to her attorney. Gregory was not in the room. He was smart enough to remain entirely out of the official legal proceedings. Derek, however, sat in the gallery right behind his mother, shooting me looks of profound disappointment and pity whenever the judge glanced in his direction. The proceedings began, and the judge, an older woman with a stern but sympathetic face, looked down at me from the bench. She asked my assigned public defender if we were prepared to contest the asset division. My lawyer, who knew absolutely nothing about V-Core Group or the $510 million, leaned toward the microphone and stated that his client was completely overwhelmed and wished to surrender all claims to expedite the process. I stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the wooden table to simulate a slight tremor in my hands. I spoke in a quiet, defeated voice. I told the judge that I did not want to fight anymore. I stated on the official record that I was freely surrendering my entire equity stake in the house, my vehicles, and any claim to alimony. I agreed to sign over the property deed directly to Cynthia, leaving with nothing but the small remaining balance in my personal checking account. The judge frowned, looking at me with genuine concern. She warned me that I was leaving a 40-year marriage virtually destitute. I simply lowered my head and replied that I just wanted peace. Cynthia covered her mouth, masking a victorious smile behind her tissue. Derek nodded approvingly from the gallery, knowing that the forged $1 million mortgage debt was now permanently attached to the house that Cynthia technically owned, but was legally in my name. They believed they had successfully trapped me in an unpayable debt while taking all the clean assets for themselves. The judge struck her gavel, finalizing the divorce decree. Cynthia eagerly signed the final paperwork, her pen moving swiftly across the pages. She believed she had just secured a free, unencumbered multi-million-dollar asset. She was completely oblivious to the radioactive financial bomb Derek had planted inside it, and she had absolutely no idea that I knew every single detail. I signed my portion with a cheap plastic pen, surrendering the illusion of my past life forever. As I exited the heavy brass doors of the courthouse, a light freezing rain began to fall. I walked down the wide concrete steps and stood near a bus stop on the corner, pulling up the collar of my worn coat. I waited patiently in the drizzle. A few minutes later, the low, aggressive growl of a high-performance engine echoed down the street. A pristine silver Porsche 911 pulled up slowly to the curb right in front of me. Gregory Thorne was behind the wheel, wearing expensive dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Cynthia sat in the passenger seat, looking radiant and victorious. Derek leaned forward from the small back seat. Gregory lowered the passenger window. The warm leather-scented air of the luxury car drifted out into the cold rain. He looked me up and down, a look of absolute unadulterated contempt on his face. "Have a nice life, Harrison." Gregory sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Try not to freeze out here." Derek laughed loudly from the back seat. Cynthia did not say a word. She just looked away, completely dismissing my existence as if I were a stranger begging for change. Gregory revved the powerful engine. As the car began to pull away, he carelessly tossed a crumpled $20 bill out the window. It fluttered through the rain and landed directly in a muddy puddle at my feet. The Porsche accelerated rapidly, the tires kicking up a spray of dirty water onto my trousers as they sped off toward their celebratory lunch. I did not flinch. I did not bend down to pick up the money. I stood perfectly still in the freezing rain, watching the red taillights of the Porsche disappear into the city traffic. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my wet coat and pulled out my smartphone. I dialed a highly encrypted private number. It was answered on the first ring. "Victor." I said, my voice completely devoid of the weakness I had just portrayed in the courtroom. "I am here, Mr. Caldwell." Victor Cross replied, his tone sharp and ready. "How did the proceedings go?" Flawlessly, I stated, staring down at the muddy $20 bill. "They took the bait entirely." Cynthia signed the final decree. She formally accepted the house and all attached liabilities, fully believing it is a clean asset. "Excellent," Victor said. "The legal framework is set. What are your immediate orders?" "I want you to initiate the acquisition protocols through V-Core Group immediately." I commanded my engineering mind, locking onto the tactical execution of the strike. "I want our financial team to contact the private lending institution Derek Caldwell used to secure that illicit mortgage. Buy that specific $1 million debt portfolio today. Pay whatever premium is necessary to secure it. I want V-Core Group to own the exclusive rights to that mortgage, and I want you to prepare the immediate foreclosure documentation citing fraudulent application data." "Consider it done," Victor replied smoothly. "The debt will be transferred to our holding accounts by close of business today." "What about Apex Dynamics?" "Prepare the hostile takeover documentation." I instructed, my eyes sweeping across the towering skyline of the financial district. "Compile the forensic audit detailing Gregory Thorne's embezzlement, the offshore shell accounts, and his strategy to bankrupt the company. Coordinate directly with your contacts at the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I want the FBI briefed and ready to move on my command." "Understood," Victor said. "The final trap is armed. When do we spring it?" "The quarterly board of directors meeting is scheduled for next Friday," I replied. "Gregory plans to solidify his absolute control. We will let him climb to the very top of his podium. We strike on Friday." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The cold rain continued to fall, but I did not feel the chill. I turned away from the bus stop and walked 2 blocks to a waiting unmarked town car that Victor had arranged for me. The driver opened the door, and I slid into the heated, quiet interior. For the next week, I operated in total silence. I moved out of the squalid motel and into a secure luxury penthouse suite managed by the Blind Trust. I spent my days reviewing the massive ironclad dossiers Victor's team had compiled. Every illegal wire transfer, every forged signature Derek had submitted, every hidden account Gregory controlled, was meticulously documented, cross-referenced, and bound in heavy leather portfolios. On Thursday afternoon, I visited an exclusive appointment only Taylor on Savile Row. I discarded the worn, pathetic suits I had worn for the past year. I was expertly measured and fitted for a bespoke charcoal gray suit woven from the finest Italian wool. I selected a crisp, brilliant white shirt and a deep crimson silk tie. When I looked in the 3-way mirror, the tired, defeated engineer was completely gone. The man staring back was the chairman of a multi-million-dollar empire, a man who commanded absolute authority and possessed the means to destroy anyone who crossed him. Friday morning arrived with brilliant, blinding sunlight. The glass and steel towers of the financial district gleamed like polished weapons against the clear blue sky. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my temporary penthouse, securing the gold fountain pen in my inner pocket. The chessboard was set. The pieces were locked in position. It was exactly 9:30 in the morning when the black Maybach pulled up to the curb. Victor Cross sat in the back holding the heavy leather dossiers. I stepped into the vehicle, the door closing with a solid, heavy thud. We drove smoothly through the city, heading directly toward the towering headquarters of Apex Dynamics. The final calculation was complete. It was time to execute the collapse. The heavy gray clouds over the city finally broke, unleashing a steady, freezing downpour as I sat in the corner booth of a rundown diner on the industrial edge of town. The vinyl seat beneath me was cracked and held together by faded strips of tape. The smell of burnt coffee and old frying oil hung thick in the damp air. I wrapped both hands around my ceramic mug, letting the meager heat seep into my cold fingers. I had deliberately chosen this depressing, isolated location. It was the perfect backdrop for the pathetic, defeated persona I needed to project. As I watched the rain streak down the grimy windowpane, my mind kept drifting back to the brief secret visit I had made to my former home the previous afternoon. I had gone under the pretense of retrieving my old engineering toolboxes from the garage. Cynthia had been furious, hovering in the doorway with her arms crossed, eager for me to leave. But she was careless. While carrying my boxes out, I had walked past her so-called meditation room. Her canvas yoga bag was unzipped, and the unmistakable heavy stench of a cheap, musky men's cologne hit my senses. It was the exact brand Gregory Thorne wore to the office. The final, undeniable confirmation had come when I remembered the watch. During the humiliating ambush in my office, Gregory had confidently checked the time on a limited edition Patek Philippe. It was the precise model Cynthia had purchased on my primary credit card a month prior, claiming it was a lavish retirement gift for her former boss. The deception was complete and utter. My wife and my employer had made me an absolute fool. But the true agony of my situation was not about them anymore. The ultimate test of my shattered life was walking through the diner doors at this exact moment. The bell above the entrance chimed sharply. My son Derek stepped out of the rain and into the dim fluorescent light of the diner. He was 42 years old, impeccably groomed, and radiating an air of arrogant impatience. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that hugged his shoulders, perfectly shielded by a high-end, water-resistant trench coat. He paused near the entrance, looking around the greasy establishment with visible, undisguised disgust. He did not bother to shake off the rain. He simply spotted me in the corner booth, sighed heavily, and marched over. As he slid into the booth across from me, I immediately noticed his footwear. He was wearing custom-made Italian leather loafers. I knew the brand. They cost upward of $3,000 a pair. He crossed his legs, ensuring the expensive leather was safely away from the sticky floor. He did not take off his coat. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply placed his designer briefcase on the table and checked his smartphone. "Make it quick, Dad," Derek said, his voice clipped and highly professional, as if he were speaking to a low-level vendor. "I have a major strategy meeting in 45 minutes, and this place is completely out of my way." I forced my shoulders to slump. I lowered my gaze to the table, adopting the broken, trembling posture of a man who had lost everything. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to deliver the desperate plea I had rehearsed all morning. "Derek," I said, allowing my voice to sound raspy and weak, "I am completely out of options. The divorce lawyers have frozen my primary accounts." Cynthia took the cars. "The roadside motel I am staying in is draining the very last of my emergency cash. It is not a safe place, son. There are sirens all night, and the lock on my door is broken." Derek did not look up from his screen. He swiped his thumb across his phone, completely detached from the profound misery I was projecting. I waited for a flicker of sympathy, a momentary lapse in his cold facade. There was nothing. I found a small, cheap studio apartment in the garment district. I continued leaning slightly closer across the table. "The landlord is willing to bypass the credit check, but he needs the first and last month of rent up front. It is a total of $2,000. I just need a small temporary loan, Derek. Just enough to get me off the street and into a secure room. I promise I will pay you back the moment I can access my pension. You are my son. I have nowhere else to turn. Derek finally locked his phone and placed it face down on the table. He leaned back against the cracked vinyl, looking at me with a mixture of pity and intense irritation. He let out a long, dramatic sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if I were a massive, unbearable burden he was forced to manage. Dad, you have to be realistic here. Derek began, his tone patronizing and incredibly cold. The economy is incredibly tough right now. The market is volatile, and my personal investment portfolio took a significant hit last quarter. I have my own expenses to worry about. Maintaining my lifestyle is not cheap, and I simply do not have $2,000 of liquid cash to just hand over to you. I stared at him. I looked directly at the $3,000 Italian loafers resting beneath the table. I looked at the $500 silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat. He was a senior executive earning over $250,000 a year. $2,000 was absolute pocket change to him. It was the price of his weekend bar tabs. Yet he sat there looking his elderly father in the eye and flatly refused to provide him with basic shelter. You have to understand, Dad. You brought this entirely on yourself. Derek continued, his voice growing sharper, more accusatory. You stagnated. You spent 40 years at Apex Dynamics sitting at a drafting table while everyone else moved up. You refused to play the corporate game. You refused to secure your future. You cannot expect me to bail you out now because of your own lack of ambition. The cruelty in his words was staggering. I had paid for his elite private schooling. I had paid his entire university tuition in full, so he would graduate without a single cent of debt. I had funded the down payment for his first luxury home. I had sacrificed my own career advancement, choosing stable, predictable engineering roles, precisely so I could always be present for his childhood. And now he was using my lifelong sacrifice as the very reason to justify abandoning me to the streets. Before I could process the absolute death of my fatherly love, Derek unlatched his designer briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila folder and pushed it aggressively across the sticky table toward me. He unclipped a silver pen from his pocket and placed it directly on top of the documents. I am not here to lend you money, Dad. Derek stated, leaning forward, his eyes suddenly hungry and intensely focused. I am here because you are dragging your feet on the property division. Mom is suffering. Her mental well-being is hanging by an absolute thread because you are being stubborn. The judge granted the divorce, but the title company requires your physical signature on this specific waiver to completely release the deed of the house into her sole possession. I looked down at the legal document. It was a total relinquishment of all equity property rights and future claims regarding the marital estate. I looked back up at my son. His eyes were wide, practically burning with a desperate, impatient greed. In that solitary moment, listening to the rain hammer against the diner window, a terrifying epiphany crashed over me. Derek was not just taking his mother's side out of misplaced loyalty. He was far too invested. He was far too desperate for me to sign away the house. The realization struck me with absolute horrifying clarity. My son was an active, willing participant in my destruction. He was deeply entangled in whatever financial web Gregory and Cynthia had spun. He needed me to sign away the house because he had a massive personal financial stake in the outcome. My own flesh and blood was helping to strip the meat from my bones. The last lingering trace of paternal hesitation evaporated from my soul. The man sitting across from me was no longer my son. He was a corporate predator, an accomplice to my ruin, and an enemy who needed to be utterly dismantled. I did not argue. I did not shed a tear. I picked up the silver pen with a perfectly simulated trembling hand. I slowly, deliberately signed my name on the bottom line of the waiver, granting them full, uncontested legal ownership of the property. Derek immediately snatched the paper from the table, checking the signature with a satisfied, triumphant smirk. He shoved the folder back into his briefcase and snapped it shut. He stood up without another word, pulling his trench coat tight. He tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the table to cover my coffee. "Get your life together, Dad," Derek said coldly, turning his back on me. I sat perfectly still, watching him walk out of the diner and step into the pouring rain. He believed he had just secured his wealthy future. He had no idea he had just handed me the final necessary piece of the puzzle. He had willingly walked into the slaughterhouse. I took a sip of the bitter cold coffee. The trap was completely set, and I was ready to bring the entire empire down on their heads. The drive from the greasy diner back to the quiet streets of my former neighborhood felt like traveling between two completely different dimensions. I rode in a nondescript yellow cab, watching the manicured lawns and stone-front colonial homes roll past the rain-streaked glass. This was the affluent enclave I had spent 40 years financing with my sweat and engineering expertise. Every brick of the massive 4-bedroom house sitting at the cul-de-sac represented a sacrifice I had willingly made for a family that had just signed my eviction from their lives. The taxi pulled up a few houses down, and I instructed the driver to wait. I adjusted the worn collar of my old coat, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the damp afternoon air. I let my knees buckle as I walked up the driveway, ensuring Cynthia saw a defeated, trembling senior citizen. I did not use my key. Instead, I pressed the brass doorbell, listening to the familiar chimes echo inside the foyer. It took an agonizingly long time before the heavy oak front door swung open. Cynthia stood right there in the entryway. She was holding a half-empty glass of white wine, her expression instantly hardening into a wall of cold irritation. She did not open the screen door. She looked through the mesh wire at me as if I were a stray animal invading her pristine property. "What are you doing here, Harrison?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet suburban afternoon. "The settlement was finalized at the courthouse. You signed the waivers. You have absolutely no legal right to step onto this property anymore. If you are here to beg for money or complain about your motel room, I will call the police immediately." I forced my jaw to tremble, letting my voice drop to a weak, pathetic whisper. "I am not here to cause trouble, Cynthia," I stammered, wrapping my arms tightly around my chest, as if shivering from the cold. I just realized I left my heavy winter coats in the cedar closet upstairs. The temperature is dropping tonight, and the heating in that motel is barely functioning. I just need to grab my clothing, and I will be gone forever. I promise you that. Cynthia stared at me, her eyes tracking the worn fabric of my sleeves and my scuffed shoes. She let out a sharp, disgusted breath, unlatching the screen door with a violent click. "Fine," she snapped, turning her back on me and walking toward the kitchen. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get your things. Do not touch anything else. I am counting down the seconds, Harrison." I stepped into the quiet warmth of the foyer, the door clicking shut behind me. The house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and fresh paint. The subtle signs of a woman preparing to welcome a new occupant into the space we had shared for decades. I heard the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen, confirming Cynthia had returned to her wine and her hidden conversations. My frail, sluggish demeanor vanished the absolute instant she turned the corner. My spine straightened, my hands stopped shaking, and my internal engineering clock locked into precision timing. I did not head toward the stairs immediately. Instead, I took 3 silent, rapid strides into the formal living room. The heavy plush leather sofa we bought 5 years ago sat in the center of the room, facing the fireplace. It was the exact spot where Cynthia and Derek usually conducted their private family discussions. I reached deep into the pocket of my coat, my fingers wrapping around the cold, smooth plastic of the micro-audio recorder Victor Cross had provided. It was a military-grade device smaller than a coin, equipped with an ultra-sensitive microphone and a battery life that could last for months. I knelt beside the heavy sofa, my movements fluid and completely silent. With a kinesiologist's precision, I reached my hand beneath the dark mahogany frame, locating the thick fabric dust cover underneath. I pressed the adhesive backing of the tiny black disc firmly against the wood, right where the central support beam met the springs. I held it there for 3 seconds, ensuring the grip was absolute. It was perfectly hidden, entirely invisible to anyone cleaning or vacuuming the room. It would capture every whisper, every laugh, and every conspiratorial plan uttered on that couch. I stood up smoothly, adjusting my jacket, and checked the timer in my head. 45 seconds had elapsed. I quickly walked upstairs, taking care to make my footsteps sound heavy and labored, so Cynthia would believe I was struggling up the steps. I entered the cedar closet, grabbed 3 of my oldest, heaviest winter coats, and draped them over my arm. I did not linger on the old photographs or the empty spaces on the shelves. The emotional ties to this house were entirely severed. I marched back downstairs, letting out a simulated, heavy wheeze as I neared the kitchen doorway. Cynthia was standing by the marble island, her back to me, furiously typing a text message on her phone. She did not even turn around when I muttered that I had found my coats. "Your 5 minutes are up," she said coldly, her eyes never leaving her screen. "Lock the door on your way out." I stepped out onto the front porch, the cool breeze catching the heavy coats draped over my left arm. The afternoon rain had slowed to a light misting drizzle, leaving the concrete driveway slick and dark. Cynthia's luxury electronic SUV was parked directly in front of the garage, its polished black paint gleaming under the overcast sky. This was the $70,000 vehicle I had fully paid off 2 years ago, a car she now claimed as her exclusive property. I walked down the driveway, purposely letting one of my heavy coats slip from my arm. It tumbled onto the wet concrete right beside the rear driver's side wheel of the SUV. I dropped to one knee, groaning softly, as if my 70-year-old joints were failing me. To any casual observer or a hidden camera, I was simply an old man struggling to retrieve his dropped clothing in the rain. But beneath the shadow of the vehicle, my right hand moved with blinding speed. I pulled the magnetic GPS tracker from my sleeve. It was a heavy waterproof box wrapped in a dark rubberized coating. I slid my arm under the rear bumper, reaching up into the wheel well to locate the massive steel frame of the chassis. The powerful magnets clicked against the metal with a dull, muted thud. I pushed it upward, ensuring it was wedged tightly. It was completely secure. I scooped up the wet winter coat, forced myself to stagger back to my feet, and brushed the dirt from my trousers. I walked down to the curb, where the yellow cab was idling its exhaust pipe, puffing white smoke into the cold air. I opened the door and entered with a frail, shaking posture, fully playing my part, until the taxi finally pulled away cleanly. The yellow cab drove me several miles away from the affluent suburban streets before I instructed the driver to pull over near a busy subway station. I paid him in cash, stepped out into the damp city air, and walked down into the subterranean transit system. I took 3 different trains, ensuring my route was entirely untraceable before finally emerging in the heart of the financial district. I walked the remaining 3 blocks to my secure luxury penthouse. The moment the heavy reinforced door locked behind me, the pathetic facade of the broken father completely vanished from my physical posture. I shed the damp, worn coat and the scuffed shoes, replacing them with dry clothes and a sense of absolute purpose. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk in the center of the room and opened my secure laptop. I had barely poured myself a glass of cold water when my encrypted smartphone vibrated on the polished wood. The caller ID displayed Victor Cross. I answered the call immediately. "We have breached the firewall," Victor stated, his voice devoid of any standard greeting, but laced with a sharp professional satisfaction. "The forensic accounting team has bypassed their strict protocols. They navigated the internal security measures without triggering a single executive alarm." Victor continued, his tone smooth and calculating. "We are fully inside the Apex Dynamics mainframe right now, and the sheer volume of encrypted data we have successfully uncovered is absolutely staggering. I need you to come to the secure briefing room immediately." I did not waste a single second. I left the penthouse and took the private elevator directly down to the subterranean parking garage, where Victor's black town car was already waiting. The drive to the brutalist steel structure was swift and completely silent throughout the trip. When I entered the 40th floor conference room, Victor was standing in front of a wall composed entirely of high-resolution digital monitors. 3 of his elite forensic accountants were seated at a long table, their fingers flying rapidly across encrypted keyboards. They did not look up when I entered the room. They were entirely focused on dismantling the complex financial architecture of the man who had attempted to ruin my career. Victor gestured toward the largest screen located directly in the center of the room. It displayed a massive, intricately detailed flowchart mapping thousands of specific banking monetary transactions. The digital map connected vendor payments, corporate routing numbers, and offshore holding accounts. Gregory Thorne is not just embezzling from the company. Victor began stepping aside so I could view the full catastrophic scope of the devastation. He is systematically bleeding it entirely dry. Over the past 8 months since he officially assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer, he has authorized the creation of 14 different dummy corporations. These empty shell companies are entirely registered in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. He has been moving capital with a reckless, highly aggressive speed that is profoundly alarming. I stepped closer to the screen, my trained engineering eyes easily deciphering the complex flow of stolen capital. Gregory was executing a classic, highly aggressive corporate bleed-out. He was intentionally inflating the operational budgets of the most critical manufacturing departments. He then routed those massive excess funds to these fictitious external vendors for consulting services that were never actually rendered. The dummy corporations would then funnel the clean, untraceable cash directly into his private offshore accounts. But the direct embezzlement was only the first initial phase of his overarching strategy. The secondary phase was far more destructive and insidious. "Look at the quarterly projections," I said, pointing to a severe downward trend line illuminated on the secondary monitor. "He is intentionally driving the stock price into the ground." Victor nodded, his expression grim and highly calculating. "Precisely. He is manipulating the corporate earnings reports to make Apex Dynamics appear fundamentally insolvent. He is intentionally creating a massive financial panic among the board of directors and the minority shareholders. Once the company reaches the absolute brink of total bankruptcy, a private equity firm he secretly controls is going to step in and offer a complete corporate buyout immediately, without hesitation. He plans to purchase the entire conglomerate for absolute pennies on the dollar," Victor explained. "He will then strip the company of its most valuable engineering patents, liquidate the remaining physical assets, and walk away with billions." I stared at the staggering, undeniable numbers flashing across the screen. Gregory was going to willfully destroy thousands of loyal employees' livelihoods just to selfishly line his own pockets. I had the legal ammunition to destroy his career right this very second. I could hand this entire detailed dossier to the federal authorities and watch him be arrested before midnight officially arrived tonight. But then a specific name caught my eye on the lower transaction ledger. I froze. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. "Pull up that secondary routing authorizations on the third dummy corporation," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. The lead accountant tapped a few keys, instantly expanding the targeted document on the main screen. There, staring back at me in high definition, was the digital signature of the independent financial consultant who had authorized the transfer of $3 million into his offshore account. The name on the digital document was crystal clear: Derek Caldwell, my own son, my flesh and blood. The horrific reality of the situation locked into place with a sickening, heavy thud inside my chest. Derek was not just a greedy son trying to steal a house from his elderly father. He was the primary corporate financial architect. Derek was actively laundering the stolen money for the man who was sleeping with his mother. The family rot was total, absolute, and utterly irredeemable. They were all in this together. They were a unified, toxic syndicate functioning perfectly to ensure my total destruction and their own ultimate illegal financial enrichment. I placed my hands flat against the cool surface of the conference table, letting the magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. "Do we have enough concrete evidence to link Derek directly to the embezzlement scheme?" I asked Victor, my tone completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "We have his digital footprint on over $12 million in illicit transfers," Victor confirmed smoothly. "He is legally exposed. If we release this file to the federal prosecutors, your son will face a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and major money laundering criminal charges." I looked at the glowing screens, feeling a profound, cold clarity settle over my mind. They had all participated in my execution. I would not spare a single one of them. "Do not alert the authorities yet," I instructed Victor, turning away from the monitors. "I have the bullet to end Gregory right now, but I want all of them standing perfectly in the crosshairs when I finally pull the trigger. Keep monitoring their communications. Let them believe their plan is functioning flawlessly. When the corporate board meets on Friday, the entire Caldwell family is going to burn completely together." The days leading up to the final confrontation required an agonizing level of patience. It was Friday evening, exactly 1 week before the scheduled board of directors meeting, where Gregory Thorne planned to execute his final corporate slaughter. I sat alone in the dim light of my secure penthouse, the sprawling city skyline glittering outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. My encrypted smartphone rested on the polished mahogany desk in front of me, its screen glowing with a faint blue light. I reached out and tapped the tracking application Victor Cross had installed. A highly detailed digital map of the city materialized, zooming in rapidly on a single blinking red dot. Cynthia had left our former suburban home 3 hours ago. She had sent me a brief, emotionally vacant text message earlier that afternoon, claiming she was departing for yet another intensive, weekend-long healing yoga retreat in the mountains. She explicitly requested that I not contact her under any circumstances, stating she needed absolute isolation to process the heavy emotional trauma of our finalized divorce. I stared at the blinking red dot on the screen. The digital marker was not located anywhere near the serene wooded mountains of the upstate retreats. It was entirely stationary, pinging a continuous, unmoving signal from the deepest level of a private, high-security underground parking garage. The address was completely unmistakable. It was an ultra-exclusive multi-million-dollar residential skyscraper located in the absolute center of the downtown financial district. It was the exact building where Gregory Thorne owned a lavish 2-story penthouse suite. A cold, mechanical calm washed over me. I did not feel the sudden burning sting of heartbreak. The emotional center of my chest had been cauterized completely shut. What I felt was the chilling satisfaction of an engineer watching a complex theoretical hypothesis proven absolutely correct through undeniable physical data. I closed the laptop, slipped the encrypted phone into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, and took the private elevator down to the subterranean garage. I bypassed the luxurious town car Victor had provided and selected a generic dark sedan I had rented specifically for discreet, untraceable movement. The drive across the city was smooth and entirely devoid of traffic. The evening rain had returned, slicking the dark asphalt and reflecting the neon lights of the passing storefronts. I navigated the familiar towering canyons of the financial sector, my mind reviewing every single lie Cynthia had fed me over the past 12 months. Every spiritual awakening, every tearful complaint about my lack of ambition, every desperate plea for personal space had been meticulously crafted to blind me to the reality of her profound betrayal. I arrived at the targeted address and bypassed the heavily guarded main entrance of that building. Instead, I drove down a narrow, dimly lit service alley located directly across the street. I parked the dark sedan behind a massive commercial dumpster, completely obscuring the vehicle from the main avenue. I turned off the engine, killed the headlights, and rolled down the driver's side window, just enough to let the cold, damp air filter into the cabin. I sat in the absolute darkness of the car, my eyes adjusting to the shadows. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a pair of high-powered military-grade binoculars Victor had secured for me. I raised the heavy rubberized optics to my eyes and focused the lenses on the towering structure across the street. I counted the floors, sweeping my gaze up the gleaming glass facade until I reached the very top. The penthouse level was wrapped in an expansive wraparound outdoor terrace, completely illuminated by soft, ambient architectural lighting. It took less than 3 minutes of patient observation before the heavy sliding glass doors of the terrace opened. Gregory Thorne stepped out into the cool night air. He was wearing an expensive tailored silk smoking jacket, looking completely relaxed and supremely arrogant. He walked to the edge of the glass railing, looking down at the glittering city below him as if he owned every single building in his line of sight. He believed he was the untouchable king of a vast corporate and financial empire. A few seconds later, another figure stepped out onto the terrace to join him. I adjusted the focus wheel on the binoculars, bringing the image into sharp, undeniable clarity. It was Cynthia. She was wearing a sleek, dark evening dress, her hair perfectly styled, looking nothing like a woman seeking spiritual healing in a remote mountain cabin. She carried 2 elegant crystal champagne flutes, handing one to Gregory with a bright, radiant smile. He took the glass, wrapped his free arm intimately around her waist, and pulled her close against his chest. They stood together at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the sprawling metropolis, laughing at some private shared joke. I watched as they raised their glasses, clinking the delicate crystal together in a silent, celebratory toast. They were toasting to their perceived victory. They were celebrating the flawless execution of their grand, devastating plan. They were drinking to the absolute destruction of Harrison Caldwell, fully believing that I was sitting in a squalid, freezing motel room, drowning in poverty and pathetic despair. I watched my wife of 40 years lean up and kiss the man who had systematically ruined my career, her posture radiating a relaxed, triumphant comfort. The visual confirmation was absolute. The physical proof of their affair was laid bare before my eyes, leaving absolutely no room for doubt or denial. I lowered the heavy binoculars and placed them carefully onto the passenger seat. I rested my hands on the leather steering wheel, listening to the patter of the rain against the roof of the dark sedan. The betrayal was profound and methodical. They had taken my money, my home, my career, and my dignity. But as I sat there in the cold shadows watching them celebrate their stolen wealth, a darker thought began to take shape in my mind. The affair and the corporate embezzlement were devastating, but they felt almost too clean, too straightforward for the sheer level of sociopathic calculation Gregory and Cynthia had displayed. Derek and his involvement in the deed transfer had proven that the conspiracy ran far deeper than a simple workplace romance and a standard hostile takeover. The true depth of their malevolence had not yet been fully exposed. I realized that the physical affair was merely the surface layer of a hidden agenda. The real horror of their ultimate plan was still lurking in the dark, waiting to be uncovered, and I possessed the exact tool necessary to drag it into the light. My hand slowly moved toward the hidden audio receiver resting in the center console. The micro-recorder I had planted beneath the living room sofa in my home was active, transmitting every sound directly to my secure device. I knew that whatever terrible secrets they were keeping, the device would capture every syllable. The nightmare was just beginning to unfold before me. The heavy rain from Friday had finally stopped by the time Sunday evening arrived, leaving the city air thick with a damp, suffocating humidity. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the sagging mattress in room 12 of the dilapidated roadside motel. I had returned to this miserable, decaying box for one specific reason. I needed to remain completely invisible. If Cynthia or Derek had hired anyone to watch me, if they were monitoring my movements to ensure I was truly defeated, they would find me exactly where they left me. In the squalor, in the shadows, entirely alone. I pulled my secure laptop from its protective case and placed it on the rickety wooden desk under the flickering light of a single bare bulb. I connected my noise-canceling headphones and logged into the highly encrypted cloud server Victor Cross had established for me. The military-grade micro-audio recorder I had planted beneath the leather sofa in my former living room had been transmitting continuously for 48 hours. It was time to harvest the data. I clicked the download button, watching the progress bar fill as the massive audio file transferred to my local drive. I placed the headphones over my ears, completely blocking out the distant wail of police sirens on the highway outside. I pressed play. At first, there was only the faint ambient static of an empty room. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of the heavy mahogany front door opening and closing. I recognized the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Cynthia's expensive designer heels against the hardwood floor of the foyer. A second set of footsteps followed, heavier and far more confident. It was Gregory Thorne. I could hear the soft clinking of crystal glasses, the splash of liquor being poured, and the low, throaty murmur of their voices. They were relaxed, settling onto the plush leather sofa, exactly where I knew they would. For the first 20 minutes, the recording captured nothing but mundane domestic chatter. They discussed the weather, a new restaurant opening downtown, and the tedious details of Gregory's corporate schedule. It was infuriatingly normal. But then the heavy front door opened a second time. I recognized the heavy, hurried footsteps immediately. It was Derek. My son had let himself into the house using his old spare key. I heard Cynthia greet him with a warm, maternal enthusiasm that she had not directed toward me in over a decade. Gregory greeted him casually, offering him a drink. The three of them were gathered together in my living room, sharing my space, drinking my liquor. The atmosphere on the recording was deeply celebratory. There was no tension, no awkwardness about the fact that Derek was casually socializing with the man who had actively destroyed his father's career and dismantled his parents' marriage. They were a cohesive unit. I closed my eyes, focusing every ounce of my attention on the digital audio feed. I needed to hear every single syllable. Derek took a long, audible sip of his drink and sighed contentedly. He leaned back against the leather cushions. The leather creaked right above the hidden microphone, making his voice incredibly loud and sharp in my ears. "I have excellent news," Derek announced, his tone brimming with arrogant pride. "I met with the old man at that pathetic diner on the edge of town on Friday. He is completely broken. He was practically begging me for a $2,000 loan to rent a miserable little studio apartment. It was actually quite pathetic to watch. But the important part is that he took the bait. He signed the final deed waiver without a single ounce of hesitation. He surrendered all equity and all legal claims to the property." Cynthia let out a soft, relieved laugh. "Thank God," she murmured. "I was terrified he was going to hire a competent lawyer and demand a forensic accounting of the marital assets." "He is far too stupid for that," Derek sneered. "He genuinely believes you are taking on a massive financial burden by keeping this house. He has absolutely no idea about the secondary mortgage." I gripped the edge of the wooden desk, my knuckles turning completely white. A secondary mortgage. I listened closer, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Gregory chuckled, a deep, resonant sound of pure amusement. "You executed that perfectly," Derek Gregory said smoothly. "The offshore accounts received the capital transfer yesterday afternoon. Your forgery skills are truly exceptional." I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. I stopped breathing. The full, horrifying scope of their conspiracy unspooled in my ears. Derek laughed, a cold, triumphant sound that echoed through the headphones. "It was incredibly easy," Derek boasted. "The old man never checks his primary credit alerts. I used his digital signature to apply for a $1 million illicit secondary mortgage against the equity of this house. Because his credit rating was flawless, the private lending institution approved the massive cash extraction in less than 48 hours. I funneled the entire $1 million directly into your newly established Cayman Islands shell accounts to artificially inflate the operational budgets you needed for the Apex Dynamics buyout. The old man literally handed over the house, completely unaware that he just absorbed a $1 million fraudulent debt and simultaneously funded your corporate takeover." Cynthia giggled again, the sound slicing through my soul like a jagged blade. "He is going to be paying off a loan he never knew he took out for the rest of his miserable life," she said. "And the best part is he still thinks I am the victim in all of this." They raised their glasses. I could hear the sharp, clear ring of the crystal toasting their flawless victory. I paused the recording. I pulled the headphones down, letting them rest around my neck. The silence of the motel room rushed back in, suffocating and incredibly heavy. I sat perfectly still, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my mind attempting to process the absolute bottomless depth of the cruelty I had just witnessed. My own son had not just abandoned me in my perceived hour of desperate need. He had not just turned a blind eye to his mother's infidelity. Derek had actively, maliciously forged my legal signature to steal $1 million of my hard-earned equity. He had deliberately saddled me with an impossible, fraudulent debt. And the most sickening, horrifying realization of all was the destination of that stolen money. My son had robbed me blind, specifically to finance the man who was sleeping with his mother. Derek had funded Gregory Thorne's illegal corporate embezzlement scheme using the very walls that had sheltered him throughout his entire childhood. The moral bankruptcy was so profound, so entirely complete, that it defied all rational comprehension. They were not just greedy. They were sociopathic predators who derived genuine, sickening pleasure from my total destruction. I reached out and closed the laptop. The faint hum of the hard drive spun down, plunging the room into total silence. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel any urge to scream. I sat in the heavy silence of the motel room, staring at the closed lid of my secure laptop. The faint hum of the highway traffic outside seemed entirely detached from the suffocating reality inside these four damp walls. I had stopped the recording precisely when the sheer horror of my son's financial forgery was revealed, believing that the absolute bottom of their depravity had been reached. I was wrong. My trained engineering mind, accustomed to following every complex mechanism to its absolute conclusion, demanded that I finish listening to the data. I needed to know the final granular details of their blueprint. I slowly reached out, lifted the laptop screen, and placed the heavy noise-canceling headphones back over my ears. I moved the cursor and clicked play. The digital audio feed instantly transported me back into the center of my former living room. The celebratory atmosphere had settled into a low, comfortable murmur. Ice clinked against the sides of heavy crystal tumblers. Gregory Thorne let out a satisfied sigh, the sound vibrating harshly through the hidden micro-recorder planted just inches beneath him. I listened to the steady rhythm of their breathing, a perfectly synchronized trinity of predators resting after a successful hunt. Then Cynthia's voice cut through the ambient static. Her tone was no longer filled with the giggling excitement of the initial revelation. It had shifted into something sharp, practical, and entirely devoid of human empathy. She was thinking ahead, managing the final loose ends of their grand conspiracy. "Gregory," she began, her words crisp and demanding, "we need to be absolutely certain about the timeline of the fallout. When the private lending institution finally realizes that the monthly payments on that $1 million secondary mortgage are not being made, what exactly is the protocol? What is going to happen to Harrison when the bank officially initiates the foreclosure process on the house?" I held my breath in the damp motel room, waiting for a flicker of hesitation, or perhaps a small trace of lingering guilt from the woman I had spent 40 years providing for. There was absolutely none. Gregory responded with the clinical, detached precision of a surgeon explaining a routine amputation. He took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "The mechanism is completely bulletproof," Cynthia Gregory stated smoothly. "Because Derek utilized his secure digital signature and routed the application through his personal executive terminal, the bank legally views Harrison as the sole autonomous guarantor of the massive loan. When the loan goes into default next month, the bank will immediately seize the property. The ensuing legal fees and the aggressive compound interest will absolutely bury him. He will be held entirely and personally responsible for the monumental remaining balance. He will have his remaining pension garnished, his accounts completely frozen, and the authorities will physically throw him out into the street. He will be entirely destitute." The silence that followed Gregory's brutal assessment was heavy and expectant. I waited for my son to intervene to perhaps suggest a slightly less devastating outcome for his own father. I waited for Cynthia to balk at the sheer unadulterated cruelty of leaving me to die in abject poverty. Instead, the hidden microphone captured the soft, unmistakable sound of Cynthia shifting comfortably against the leather sofa. "Good," she said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that chilled the marrow in my bones. "Let him rot in whatever miserable slum he manages to crawl into. He spent 40 years chaining me to his pathetic, mediocre existence, forcing me to endure his utter lack of vision. It is only fitting that he spends his final years wallowing in the absolute squalor he always belonged in. Just focus on our future. Gregory, ensure the corporate transition goes smoothly, and most importantly, make absolutely certain that Derek gets his promised vice president title the very moment the private equity firm takes over Apex Dynamics. I have earned my freedom, and my son has earned his seat at the table. Do not let the old man's messy financial ruin distract you from our primary objectives." Derek let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. He did not sound conflicted. He did not sound burdened by the monumental betrayal he had just orchestrated against his own blood. He sounded entirely relieved and profoundly greedy. The crystal glasses clinked together once again, ringing out clearly over the audio feed. "You do not need to worry about him dragging this out in court, Mom," Derek said confidently, his voice dripping with condescension. "The old man is incredibly weak. He practically looked like a walking corpse when I saw him at the diner on Friday. He was shaking completely, pathetic, practically begging for pocket change just to rent a filthy studio apartment in the garment district. I give it a few weeks, maybe a month at most, before the extreme stress of the eviction and the massive bank fraud investigation completely breaks him. You know his extensive medical history. You know his blood pressure is already a constant issue. His weak heart will simply give out under the crushing weight of the absolute panic and the sheer financial terror. The problem will entirely solve itself naturally, and it will be completely untraceable back to us. I will personally clear out his remaining cheap personal effects, and we will never have to speak his name or deal with his pathetic presence ever again. Cheers to the new arrangement, Gregory. Cheers to the beautiful future." I listened as the three of them laughed, their voices blending together in a harmonious chorus of absolute malice. They were openly toasting to my impending death. They were casually drinking champagne over the perfectly engineered grave they had meticulously dug for me. I reached out and slowly pressed the spacebar on the keyboard. The audio recording stopped instantly, severing the connection to my former living room and plunging the squalid motel space back into an absolute ringing silence. I pulled the heavy headphones from my ears and placed them gently onto the wooden desk beside the glowing laptop screen. I sat perfectly motionless on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring straight ahead at the peeling yellow wallpaper. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to scream or hurl my fists against the decaying walls. The crushing sorrow that had initially weighed down my chest was completely eradicated, burned away by the sheer, unadulterated reality of their combined wickedness. The naive, devoted husband who had spent 40 years trying to provide a stable, loving home was officially dead. The forgiving, proud father who had sacrificed his own professional ambitions to fund his ungrateful son's elite education had perished completely in this dismal room. They had successfully killed Harrison Caldwell, the family man, but they were entirely unaware of the monster they had resurrected in his place. I slowly stood up, my posture perfectly rigid, my mind operating with the cold, lethal precision of a highly advanced tactical machine. The ruthless, deeply calculating corporate predator had fully awakened, and I was going to utterly obliterate their stolen lives without mercy. Exactly 60 days later, the calendar finally aligned with my meticulous calculations. I woke up well before dawn in my secure penthouse suite and began the physical transformation necessary for my final performance. I bypassed the row of bespoke Italian suits hanging in my closet and reached into a plastic bag I had kept specifically for this occasion. I pulled out a frayed, oversized suit that hung loosely on my frame. I had deliberately starved myself of sleep for the past 2 nights to ensure the dark circles under my eyes were genuine and pronounced. My hair was uncombed, and I practiced a slight tremor in my left hand. I needed to look like a man whose spirit had been entirely crushed by the overwhelming weight of betrayal and financial ruin. I took a plain yellow taxi to the municipal courthouse, ensuring I arrived 15 minutes early. I walked up the wide concrete steps with a slow, shuffling gait, keeping my shoulders hunched and my gaze fixed firmly on the ground. When I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4, my assigned public defender was already waiting. He was a young, overworked attorney who knew absolutely nothing about the $510 million resting in my blind trust or the devastating forensic audit I had compiled against my family. To him, I was just another tragic casualty of a ruthless corporate layoff and a bitter suburban divorce. I sat down next to him without uttering a single word, letting my silence convey a profound, exhausting despair. A few minutes later, the heavy doors swung open again, and Cynthia made her grand entrance. She was accompanied by a high-priced, aggressive divorce attorney whose hourly rate likely exceeded my former weekly salary. Cynthia had dressed perfectly for her chosen role. She wore a modest, pale gray dress with minimal makeup, and her posture radiated a practiced, fragile sorrow. She walked to the petitioner table directly across the aisle from me. She did not look in my direction. Instead, she immediately pulled a crisp white tissue from her purse and began dabbing delicately at the dry corners of her eyes. She leaned over and whispered something to her lawyer, projecting the image of an emotionally exhausted woman who had endured decades of neglect and was simply seeking a peaceful escape. The judge entered the room shortly after. He was a stern-looking man with silver hair and a deeply lined face who commanded instant authority. As he took his seat at the elevated bench, he peered over his reading glasses and scanned the room. His gaze landed on me, and I immediately saw a brief flash of genuine pity register in his eyes. I looked entirely pathetic. I looked like a discarded relic of a man who had completely surrendered to the harsh realities of a cruel world. The judge cleared his throat and officially called the proceedings to order. He instructed the lawyers to present the final division of assets for judicial review and permanent ratification legally. Her lawyer stood up confidently and began to aggressively outline their demands. He painted a masterful portrait of a stagnant marriage, claiming that my recent sudden loss of income and my complete lack of future earning potential made it entirely necessary for Cynthia to retain the primary marital residence. He argued that forcing a sale of the property would cause his client undue emotional trauma and severe financial hardship. He formally requested that I surrender all claims to the equity in the house, relinquish any rights to spousal support, and walk away with only my severely depleted personal checking account and a rusted 10-year-old sedan. When he finished his lengthy speech, the judge turned his attention directly to me. He asked my public defender if we intended to contest these incredibly lopsided terms. My young lawyer leaned toward the microphone and stated that his client was completely overwhelmed by the circumstances and wished to accept the terms to avoid a protracted legal battle. The judge frowned, clearly troubled by the absolute disparity of the settlement. He looked down at me and asked me to stand. He wanted to hear the confirmation directly from my own mouth. I grasped the edge of the wooden table, allowing my knuckles to turn white as I slowly pulled myself up to a standing position. I made sure my legs appeared unsteady. I looked up at the judge and spoke in a quiet, raspy whisper that barely carried across the totally silent courtroom. I told the honorable judge that I did not possess the strength to fight anymore. I stated on the official legal record that I was freely and voluntarily surrendering my entire equity stake in our marital home. I explicitly relinquished my vehicles, my investments, and any future claim to alimony or financial support from my wife. I declared that I would sign over the property deed directly to Cynthia, now completely uncontested. I lowered my head and added that I simply wanted to find some tiny measure of peace in my remaining years. The judge sighed heavily, a sound of profound institutional resignation. He warned me one final time that I was legally agreeing to walk away from a 40-year marriage completely destitute. I simply nodded my head and whispered that I understood the consequences of my actions. Across the aisle, I saw Cynthia cover her mouth with her hands, masking a massive, victorious smile behind her pristine tissue. Her lawyer gave her a brief congratulatory nod. They fully believed they had just executed the perfect legal robbery. The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, officially finalizing the harsh divorce decree. He ordered the bailiff to distribute the final binding paperwork for our immediate signatures. The bailiff handed a thick stack of documents to Cynthia first. She snatched the expensive pen from her attorney. She signed her name eagerly, her hand gliding swiftly across every single page. She was absolutely radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. She firmly believed she had just secured a free, unencumbered, multi-million-dollar asset. She thought she was walking out of this courthouse as a wealthy, independent woman who had successfully discarded her useless husband. She was completely unaware of the massive financial time bomb ticking away beneath the foundation of her suburban mansion. She had no idea that I knew every detail about the toxic $1 million illicit secondary mortgage that our son Derek had secretly attached to the property. She did not know that Derek had forged my signature to extract that sum to fund Gregory Thorne and his corporate shell accounts. And she did not realize that by eagerly signing this final divorce decree and legally claiming sole ownership of the house, she was officially assuming total legal liability for that massive unpayable debt. I watched her hand the signed documents back to the bailiff with a radiant smile. I then took the cheap plastic pen offered by my public defender. I carefully signed my name on the final line, securing my absolute freedom. The trap was now locked, and Cynthia had eagerly swallowed the poison. I walked out of the massive double doors of the municipal courthouse, leaving the stale, suffocating air of the legal proceedings behind me. The heavy gray sky above the city had finally broken, unleashing a steady, freezing downpour that immediately soaked through the thin shoulders of my oversized frayed suit. To the casual observers rushing past me with their umbrellas and briefcases, I was nothing more than a defeated senior citizen, a tragic casualty of a ruthless legal system who had just lost absolutely everything he had worked his entire life to build. I maintained the carefully calculated illusion of frailty, letting my shoulders slump and my steps drag across the wet concrete. I walked past the line of waiting taxicabs, deliberately ignoring the dry warmth they offered. Instead, I navigated my way toward a rusted, exposed city bus stop situated at the far corner of the busy intersection. The metal bench was slick with cold rain and accumulated city grime, but I sat down anyway, letting the freezing droplets run down my face and soak into my collar. I needed to play my part until the very end. I needed Cynthia and Derek to believe their victory was entirely absolute, that I was utterly destitute, waiting for public transportation in the freezing rain while they celebrated their million-dollar triumph. The busy street in front of the courthouse was a chaotic river of honking cabs and rushing delivery trucks, but my ears caught a distinct, powerful mechanical growl cutting through the ambient noise of the heavy traffic. It was the unmistakable, deep-throated roar of a highly tuned premium German combustion engine. I kept my head bowed, staring at the growing puddles pooling around my scuffed, waterlogged shoes, but my peripheral vision tracked the sleek, metallic silhouette cutting aggressively across 3 lanes of traffic. The vehicle abruptly swerved toward the curb, its wide tires slicing through the standing water and sending a freezing wave splashing violently against the side of the bus stop shelter. A pristine charcoal gray Porsche 911 idled exactly 3 feet away from me. The gleaming sports car sat low to the ground, radiating wealth speed and an aggressive, untouchable arrogance. The dark-tinted passenger window slid down with a smooth, silent electronic hum, immediately releasing the warm, heavily perfumed air of the luxurious cabin out into the freezing street. The ambient sounds of the city faded as I looked up from the wet concrete, meeting the gaze of the occupants inside the expensive vehicle. Gregory Thorne sat firmly behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his hands resting casually on the controls. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that perfectly matched the exterior of his expensive car, and a sickeningly smug, victorious smile stretched widely across his handsome face. He looked at me not as a former colleague or a fellow human being, but as a pathetic insect he had just successfully crushed beneath his polished designer shoe. Sitting directly beside him in the passenger seat was Cynthia. She had completely discarded the tragic weeping facade she had flawlessly maintained inside the courtroom just 10 minutes prior. Her eyes were bright alive with a toxic, exhilarating thrill. She leaned over the leather console, looking down at my shivering, rain-soaked form with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. Behind them, sitting comfortably in the cramped leather rear seats, was Derek, my own flesh and blood. My son leaned forward, pushing his face between Gregory and Cynthia, his features twisted into a cruel, mocking sneer. The three of them burst into a synchronized, echoing chorus of cruel laughter. The sound was sharp, vicious, and entirely devoid of any human empathy. "Look at him," Derek jeered, his voice cutting through the steady rhythm of the falling rain. The great Harrison Caldwell, reduced to waiting for the public bus in a cheap, soggy suit. "I hope you enjoy your new miserable life, old man." Gregory revved the powerful engine, sending a loud, intimidating roar echoing off the surrounding concrete buildings. Cynthia giggled, resting her hand intimately on Gregory's shoulder. "We just thought we would stop by and offer our deepest condolences," she said, her tone dripping with saccharine malice. "It really is a terrible tragedy that you have to start over at your age with absolutely nothing to your name. But do not worry about the house, Harrison. Gregory and I will take exceptionally good care of the master bedroom." Derek laughed louder, clapping Gregory on the shoulder. Gregory reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a crisp, brand-new $20 bill. He casually flicked his wrist, tossing the paper currency out the open window. The green bill fluttered through the damp air and landed directly in a muddy, oil-slicked puddle right at the tip of my ruined shoes. "Buy yourself a hot cup of coffee," Harrison Gregory sneered. "You look like you are going to catch a severe cold out here in the elements." Gregory did not wait for a response. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator. The Porsche's rear tires spun aggressively against the wet asphalt, kicking up another massive spray of dirty street water that coated my legs and the wooden bench. The sports car shot forward, merging violently back into the heavy city traffic. I sat perfectly still, listening to the powerful engine fade into the distance until the sleek metallic chassis disappeared completely around the next intersection. I stared at the muddy $20 bill soaking in the puddle at my feet. The final performance was officially over. The cruel, degrading pantomime was finished. I slowly stood up from the freezing metal bench. I did not shiver. I did not feel the biting cold of the winter rain soaking through my garments. My spine straightened, shedding the manufactured frailty I had carried into the courtroom. The facade of the broken, defeated father completely evaporated into the damp city air, instantly replaced by the cold, lethal precision of a man who held the absolute power to destroy worlds. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my wet jacket, bypassing the cheap disposable cellular device I used for mundane communications. My fingers wrapped around the heavy encrypted satellite smartphone Victor Cross had exclusively provided for our secure operational maneuvers. I pulled the device out, the biometric scanner immediately recognizing my thumbprint and illuminating the dark screen. I wiped a stray drop of freezing rain from the glass surface and pressed the single pre-programmed contact button. The secure line connected in less than 2 seconds. Victor answered the connection with his usual absolute professional silence, waiting for my direct command. I watched the traffic signal change from red to green, the vibrant colors reflecting brightly against the wet city pavement. The time for passive observation and careful evidence gathering had officially concluded. I spoke clearly. "Buy the $1 million mortgage debt from the bank through VCore Group today, and prep the hostile takeover paperwork for Apex. It's time." I ended the call and slipped the encrypted phone back into my pocket. I turned away from the muddy puddle and walked toward the dark, waiting shadows. The following 72 hours operated with a blinding mechanical efficiency that left absolutely no room for any margin of error. Victor Cross and his elite financial team at V-Corps Group moved with the silent, devastating precision of a highly trained military strike force executing a deeply covert operation. By Tuesday morning, the private lending institution that held the $1 million fraudulent secondary mortgage on my former suburban home received an aggressive, unsolicited buyout offer from one of our shell entities. Victor did not negotiate the standard terms or offer a discounted settlement. He simply offered to purchase the toxic debt outright, absorbing the massive loan portfolio into the vast, untraceable holding accounts of V-Corps Group. The bank executives, entirely unaware of the deep personal vendetta driving the aggressive acquisition, eagerly accepted the massive cash injection to clear their hazardous ledger. They transferred the legal title of the debt in less than 6 hours, finalizing the transaction with complete bureaucratic apathy. I was no longer simply the helpless victim of a massive financial forgery engineered by my treacherous son. Through my secure corporate proxies, I was now the absolute legal owner of the very debt my son had maliciously created to destroy me. I held the absolute power of foreclosure firmly in the palm of my hand. The trap was no longer a theoretical concept discussed in dimly lit rooms. It was a loaded, primed weapon, and I controlled the firing mechanism completely. While Victor managed the complex international wire transfers to execute the hostile takeover of Apex Dynamics behind closed doors, I focused entirely on my own physical resurrection. The pathetic frayed suit I had worn to the courthouse had served its specific theatrical purpose perfectly. But it was time to finally discard the costume of the defeated, broken victim. On Wednesday afternoon, I walked into an exclusive, highly discreet tailoring establishment located deep within the upscale commercial district. It was a quiet, wood-paneled sanctuary that catered exclusively to the absolute apex of the city elite, a place where immense power was literally woven into the garments. I did not require an appointment. The master tailor, an older gentleman with a sharp, discerning eye, immediately recognized the fundamental shift in my physical posture and the dangerous coldness in my expression. I instructed him to construct a bespoke charcoal gray suit, tailored to absolute uncompromising perfection. I selected a heavy premium worsted wool imported directly from London, a fabric deliberately designed to project an aura of unyielding authority and profound, unmistakable intimidation. For 3 grueling hours, I stood perfectly still before the towering floor-to-ceiling mirrors, while the master tailor meticulously pinned, measured, and adjusted every single millimeter of the dark fabric. The entire process was entirely silent, serving as a solemn ritual of preparation for the impending corporate slaughter. When the final fitting was completely finished, I looked at my reflection in the polished glass. The frail, trembling senior citizen, who had practically begged for mercy in the divorce proceedings, had been entirely eradicated from existence. The man staring back at me was a ruthless, calculating corporate predator, heavily armored in dark wool and fueled by a cold, inextinguishable rage. I paid the tailor a massive premium in untraceable cash for an expedited delivery, ensuring the suit would be pressed and ready by Thursday evening. I returned to my secure luxury penthouse just as the sun began to set over the sprawling financial district. The massive city skyline glittered brightly through the heavy glass windows, completely ignorant of the massive corporate earthquake I was about to unleash upon its most arrogant denizens. The penthouse was entirely silent, providing the perfect acoustic environment for my final meticulous preparations. I walked over to the heavy mahogany desk and sat down heavily in the plush leather executive chair. Resting precisely in the exact center of the polished wood was a thick black leather folder. Victor Cross had personally delivered the final physical dossier less than an hour ago, leaving it as the ultimate testament to our exhaustive investigation. I reached out and slowly opened the heavy leather cover, feeling a profound, chilling sense of calm wash over my entire central nervous system. The complex chessboard was perfectly set. Every single illegal transaction, every massive offshore wire transfer, and every piece of digital espionage had been meticulously documented, verified and legally certified by Victor's elite forensic accounting team. I slowly turned the crisp, heavy pages reviewing the absolute totality of their collective sins with a terrifying clinical detachment. The first section of the comprehensive dossier contained the undeniable, irrefutable proof of Gregory Thorne's massive corporate embezzlement scheme. There were certified bank statements detailing the exact routing numbers he deliberately used to siphon millions of dollars from Apex Dynamics directly into his 14 hidden Cayman Islands shell companies. The financial ledgers proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was intentionally driving the company toward a catastrophic, engineered bankruptcy just so his private equity partners could purchase the remaining physical assets for absolute pennies. Gregory believed he was a brilliant, untouchable financial mastermind, but the heavily documented evidence currently resting in my hands reduced him to nothing more than a common, incredibly sloppy corporate thief. The second section of the black leather folder was entirely dedicated to my treacherous son, Derek. I stared coldly at the high-resolution printouts of the forged digital signatures he had arrogantly used to secure the $1 million illicit secondary mortgage against my property. The digital timestamps perfectly matched the location data retrieved directly from his personal executive computer terminal at the firm. The evidence of his massive wire fraud and direct complicity in Gregory's money laundering operation was absolutely airtight and legally devastating. Derek had willfully chosen to sacrifice his own father to secure a meaningless corporate title. He had eagerly traded his fundamental family loyalty for a vice president position he would never actually hold. The final section of the dossier detailed Cynthia's extensive complicity. While she may not have executed the offshore transfers herself, the audio transcripts recovered from the hidden micro-recorder proved she was fully aware of the illegal enterprise. She actively encouraged the financial destruction of her husband, celebrating the fraudulent mortgage and openly wishing for my death. She signed the divorce decree completely ignorant that she legally bound herself to a massive unpayable debt. I closed the heavy leather cover, running my hand smoothly over the textured surface. The preparation phase was officially complete. The agonizing period of silent observation had ended in absolute triumph. There was nothing left to calculate, nothing left to investigate, and nothing to mourn. I walked over to the window, looking out at the towering skyscraper where Gregory and Cynthia celebrated their perceived victory. They falsely believed they won the war without a single casualty. I poured myself a single glass of aged scotch, raised the crystal tumbler toward the glowing penthouse, and took a slow sip. The board of directors meeting was scheduled for exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The total annihilation of the Caldwell family was only 12 hours away. The absolute endgame had finally arrived for them. It was exactly day 90 of my meticulously calculated exile. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the polished marble floors of the Apex Dynamics corporate headquarters. I stood silently in the darkened corridor, just outside the sprawling glass-walled boardroom. The architectural design of the executive level was entirely transparent, intended to project an image of corporate honesty. Today, that transparency provided me with a flawless, unobstructed view of the absolute peak of human arrogance. I remained perfectly hidden in the peripheral shadows of the executive mezzanine, my bespoke charcoal suit blending seamlessly into the dark acoustic paneling. I did not need to hide out of fear. I remained out of sight simply to allow them to fully savor their final moments of stolen glory. Through the thick, soundproof glass, the scene unfolding inside the massive boardroom looked exactly like the coronation of a conquering king. Gregory Thorne stood at the absolute head of the long, polished oak table. He was wearing a custom navy suit that projected aggressive authority, his posture radiating a sickening level of supreme self-importance. The remaining members of the board of directors were seated around the table, their expressions a mixture of nervous apprehension and defeated resignation. Gregory had spent the last 3 months masterfully terrorizing them with fabricated financial reports and engineered stock plunges. He had successfully convinced these seasoned executives that the company was on the absolute brink of total financial collapse, and that he alone possessed the brilliant strategic vision required to save them from complete ruin. Seated in the elevated VIP gallery overlooking the corporate table like a queen presiding over her loyal subjects was Cynthia. My former wife had completely discarded any lingering pretense of the grieving, spiritually exhausted woman she had played in the municipal courthouse. She was radiating a toxic, triumphant energy that practically vibrated through the reinforced glass. She was wearing a stunning, tailored crimson dress that deliberately commanded the attention of the entire room. But what truly captured my cold, analytical focus was the jewelry. A heavy, intricate necklace of flawless diamonds rested against her collarbone, perfectly matching the thick diamond bracelets sparkling on both of her wrists. I knew the exact origin of those exquisite stones. They were not purchased with her personal savings or Gregory's legitimate corporate salary. Those diamonds were financed directly by the illicit Cayman Islands shell accounts. She was literally wearing the physical manifestation of my stolen equity and the embezzled corporate funds, openly flaunting the spoils of their grand conspiracy for the entire executive board to witness. Gregory tapped a silver pen against the heavy wooden table, instantly commanding the total silence of the expansive room. I pressed a small, encrypted earpiece deeper into my right ear. Victor Cross had seamlessly hacked the internal audio feed of the boardroom the night before, allowing me to hear every single syllable spoken inside the glass chamber with crystal-clear precision. Gregory began his address with a low, measured tone, expertly playing the role of the reluctant but necessary savior. "We are facing an unprecedented period of severe financial turbulence," Gregory announced to the silent room. "Over the past several months, we have all witnessed the unfortunate but undeniable decline of our internal revenue streams. The previous leadership allowed a culture of stagnation and systemic inefficiency to deeply infect the core manufacturing departments of this great company." He paused, letting his words sink in, subtly twisting the knife into my legacy without ever speaking my name. I watched Cynthia smile proudly from the gallery, completely intoxicated by the smooth, confident rhythm of her lover's lies. Gregory placed his hands firmly on the table and leaned forward, projecting absolute dominance. "However, I am not a man who surrenders to adversity." Gregory continued, his voice rising with theatrical passion. "I have personally secured an exclusive, highly aggressive capital injection from a private equity consortium. This financial maneuver will completely stabilize our current market position, but it requires immediate, decisive, and permanent restructuring. Effective immediately by the emergency powers granted to me during this fiscal crisis, I am officially declaring myself the permanent Chief Executive Officer of Apex Dynamics." A low murmur rippled through the seated board members, but no one dared to raise a voice in protest. Gregory had completely paralyzed them with the sheer terror of bankruptcy. They were entirely willing to hand him the keys to the kingdom, just to save their own diminishing stock portfolios. "But a king requires loyal generals," Gregory stated, a smug, incredibly arrogant smirk spreading across his face. He turned his attention toward the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the boardroom. "We need young, aggressive, and highly adaptable leadership to navigate the complex challenges ahead of us. We need financial architects who are not afraid to make the hard, necessary choices to trim the dead weight from our corporate structure. I have identified the exact individual who possesses the ruthless ingenuity required for this new era." Gregory extended his hand toward the entrance. "I am officially appointing Derek Caldwell to the position of Executive Vice President of Global Financial Operations." The doors opened, and my son walked into the sprawling, sunlit boardroom. Derek was wearing an expensive, tailored gray suit that perfectly mirrored Gregory's aggressive corporate style. He walked with a swift, highly confident stride, his chin held high completely, basking in the admiring gaze of his mother. Cynthia actually raised her hands and clapped softly from the VIP gallery, her diamond bracelets catching the bright morning light and sending small fractured rainbows dancing across the glass walls. Derek took his place standing directly beside Gregory at the head of the massive table. He looked out at the seated board members with an expression of pure, unadulterated superiority. He truly believed he had earned this powerful position through his own brilliant intellect. He had completely convinced himself that forging his father's signature, stealing $1 million, and laundering illicit funds for a corporate predator was a masterful display of high-level executive maneuvering. "Thank you," Gregory Derrick said smoothly, his voice echoing clearly through my secure earpiece. "It is a profound honor to step into this critical role. I have spent my entire life watching the old, outdated methods fail. I am fully committed to implementing a modern, ruthlessly efficient financial strategy that will maximize our shareholder value and completely eradicate the pathetic, stagnant mentality of the past." He was openly mocking me. He was standing in the very company I had built from the ground up, with my own sweat and engineering brilliance, utilizing his inaugural speech to insult my legacy. I watched Gregory place a supportive, fatherly hand on Derrick's shoulder, completing the sickening portrait of their unified, toxic family. They were standing at the absolute summit of their engineered mountain, completely intoxicated by their stolen wealth, their illicit power, and their perceived total invincibility. I stood perfectly still in the shadows, letting the absolute reality of their impending doom wash over my mind. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. It was finally time to step out of the shadows and shatter their grand illusion forever. I stepped out from the concealing shadows of the mezzanine and walked deliberately toward the heavy oak boardroom doors. The plush carpeting absorbed the sound of my footsteps, allowing me to approach the glass-walled chamber with absolute, undetected silence. Victor Cross was already waiting in the main corridor, standing perfectly still, with a thick leather ledger tucked securely under his left arm. Flanking him on either side were two federal agents. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits, their federal badges clipped prominently to their belts, projecting an aura of absolute uncompromising legal authority. We did not need to exchange a single word. The meticulous preparation phase was over, and the execution phase was now active. I reached out, placing both of my hands flat against the polished brass handles of the massive boardroom doors. I pushed them open with a forceful, synchronized motion. The heavy oak swung inward, slamming against the interior acoustic stops with a loud resounding thud that echoed like a gunshot through the sprawling sunlit room. The sudden violent noise instantly shattered the celebratory atmosphere. The sycophantic applause that had been rippling through the executive board died in an immediate, suffocating silence. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance. I stepped across the threshold, letting the heavy doors close slowly behind me. The bespoke charcoal gray suit draped perfectly over my frame, acting as a suit of modern corporate armor. I walked with a slow, measured, and entirely unyielding stride. I did not look like the broken, defeated senior citizen who had surrendered his suburban home in a damp municipal courthouse. I exuded the cold, absolute authority of a man who possessed the power to dismantle their entire world. Victor Cross stepped into the room directly behind me, matching my deliberate pace. The two armed federal agents followed closely, taking up secure positions on either side of the entrance, physically blocking the only exit from the glass-walled chamber. The sheer level of shock radiating from the front of the room was almost tangible. Gregory Thorne stopped mid-sentence. His jaw went completely slack, and the confident, arrogant smirk he had worn just moments ago melted away into an expression of profound, unadulterated confusion. He stared at me as if a buried corpse had suddenly kicked open its casket and marched directly into his corporate sanctuary. Beside him, Derrick stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching out to grip the edge of the mahogany table for physical support. The color completely drained from the terrified face of my son, leaving his skin gray. Up in the elevated VIP gallery, Cynthia physically recoiled. She gasped a sharp, incredibly loud sound that cut cleanly through the dead silence of the boardroom. Her hands flew up to cover her chest, her fingers clutching desperately at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She looked absolutely terrified, staring down at me with wide, panicked eyes, as if I were an impossible hallucination. Gregory was the first to recover his voice. The confusion on his face rapidly twisted into a mask of pure, indignant fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his crisp white collar as he slammed both of his hands violently down onto the polished surface of the table. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Gregory bellowed, his voice vibrating with a desperate, manufactured rage. "How did you get past the lobby security perimeter?" He pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, turning his furious gaze toward the terrified board members. "Security. Call the building security immediately. I want this fired, pathetic mechanic physically removed from my boardroom this instant. He is a disgruntled, unstable former employee, and he is trespassing on private corporate property." I did not flinch. I did not alter my pace. I simply continued walking until I reached the direct center of the long oak table, stopping exactly 5 feet away from where Gregory and Derek were standing. I looked at Gregory with a calm, freezing detachment, refusing to grant his frantic outburst the dignity of a verbal response. I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy silence stretch out and stretch their frayed nerves to the absolute breaking point. Victor Cross stepped smoothly up to the table, moving with a practiced predatory grace. He did not raise his voice, but his tone carried a lethal, slicing authority that commanded the absolute attention of every single individual in the room. He lifted his right arm and dropped the heavy black leather ledger directly onto the polished mahogany surface. The thick binder hit the table with a heavy, definitive crack that echoed loudly through the tense, stagnant air. "I strongly suggest that you watch your tone, Mr. Thorne." Victor stated, his voice radiating a chilling professional calm. "You are completely out of your depth, and you are currently addressing the absolute wrong individual in that manner." Gregory stared at Victor, his chest heaving with indignant, panicked breaths. "Who the hell are you?" Gregory demanded, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of the shifting power dynamic. "And what right do you have to interrupt an official closed executive corporate meeting?" Victor offered a slow, incredibly dangerous smile. "I am Victor Cross, the Chief Legal and Financial Counsel for VCor Group," Victor explained smoothly, gesturing toward the heavy black ledger resting on the table. "And the man standing beside me is not a disgruntled former employee. You are currently addressing the new chairman of the board and the absolute 60% majority shareholder of Apex Dynamics." The words hung in the air, incredibly heavy and absolutely devastating. A collective gasp swept through the seated board of directors. The seasoned executives shifted in their leather chairs, casting terrified, confused glances between Gregory, Victor, and myself. They were witnessing a hostile corporate takeover executed with surgical, unprecedented violence. "That is an absolute, complete impossibility," Gregory stammered, his voice dropping to a weak, breathless whisper. His arrogant, commanding posture completely collapsed. He looked frantically at the surrounding board members, searching for confirmation of his own denial. "I possess the majority proxy. I have the secured backing of the private equity consortium. No single individual possesses the capital required to purchase 60% of this conglomerate. It is mathematically impossible. Nothing is impossible when you are dealing with stolen capital." "Mr. Thorne," Victor replied coldly, tapping his index finger firmly against the cover of the black ledger. "Over the past 72 hours, VCor Group aggressively acquired all outstanding minority shares and executed a hostile leveraged buyout of your supposedly secure private equity partners. The transaction was fully ratified at exactly 6 in the morning. Harrison Caldwell is now the complete, legal, uncontested owner of this entire corporation. He owns the valuable patents, he owns the manufacturing divisions, and he absolutely owns the expensive chair you are currently standing behind." Gregory Thorne physically folded in on himself. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly as he collapsed into the leather seat. Up in the gallery, Cynthia and Derek visibly paled, their triumphant illusions completely shattered by reality. The absolute, inescapable reckoning had finally arrived for all of my incredibly vicious, greedy betrayers. I did not give Gregory Thorne a single second to recover from the staggering weight of Victor Cross's revelation. I stepped forward, my polished shoes making a deliberate rhythmic sound against the hardwood floor. I reached out and placed my hand flat against the heavy black leather ledger resting on the mahogany table. With a sharp, forceful push, I slid the comprehensive forensic audit directly across the polished surface. The heavy binder glided smoothly and slammed right into Gregory's chest, forcing him to stumble backward against his luxurious leather chair. He stared down at the heavy black cover, as if it were a highly venomous, deadly serpent, ready to violently strike his heart. I looked him dead in the eyes, stripping away every single last ounce of his deeply manufactured, completely fraudulent, and utterly pathetic corporate authority forever. You stole $12 million from this company, Gregory. I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality that left no room for debate or negotiation. You engineered a fraudulent bankruptcy. You siphoned our operational capital into 14 offshore shell accounts, and you falsely believed you were entirely untouchable. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of his crimes wash over the terrified board of directors. But you made one fatal miscalculation. You left a massive digital footprint, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the federal authorities, now possess absolutely every single piece of your pathetic puzzle. Gregory opened his mouth to mount a defense, to spin another masterful web of corporate lies, but the words completely died in his throat. He looked at the two federal agents standing near the doorway. The highly trained federal agents did not hesitate for a second. They stepped forward in perfect unison, their expressions carved from solid stone. They bypassed the stunned executives and flanked Gregory on both sides. The lead agent forcefully grabbed Gregory's tailored shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the reinforced glass wall of the boardroom. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Gregory Thorne, the arrogant predator who had gleefully destroyed my family and attempted to steal my legacy, was reduced to a whimpering, utterly humiliated criminal paraded in chains before his entire board of directors. With the false king physically bound and neutralized, I slowly turned my attention to the pathetic prince standing frozen at the head of the table. Derek was trembling violently. The arrogant, triumphant sneer he had worn just minutes ago had completely dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the federal agents, then down at the handcuffed Gregory, and finally his panicked eyes locked onto mine. He took a clumsy, incredibly desperate step backward, his ridiculously expensive designer shoes slipping slightly on the highly polished, pristine white marble floor. "Dad." "Please," Derek stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "You have to listen to me." I did not know what he was doing. Gregory manipulated me. He told me it was just standard corporate restructuring. "You have to believe me, Dad." I looked directly at my own treacherous flesh and blood with a dark expression of profound, completely freezing, and absolute emptiness. I felt absolutely no paternal warmth, no lingering sympathy, and no desire to offer even a shred of mercy. "You honestly, truly believed you were going to be the new executive vice president?" Derek Waffard asked him smoothly, my tone dripping with a heavy, deeply cutting disdain. "You actually thought you possessed the intellect and the corporate acumen to lead this conglomerate?" I slowly shook my head, delivering the final crushing blow to his massive ego. "No, you are not a vice president. You are nothing but an accessory to federal bank fraud. You are a common thief who sold out his own father for a worthless title you were entirely unqualified to hold." I reached into the inner pocket of my bespoke jacket and pulled out a crisp, pristine envelope containing the certified copies of the forged mortgage documents. I handed the damning evidence directly to the second federal agent. The documents clearly display his forged digital signatures, his localized internet protocol addresses, and the exact timestamps of his fraudulent wire transfers, I informed the agent. The agent nodded firmly and stepped toward my son. Derek did not try to run. He simply collapsed. His legs gave out completely, and he fell heavily into a nearby leather chair. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to sob loudly, the pathetic heaving cries of a broken child echoing pitifully through the massive glass chamber. The sound of Derek's weeping seemed to finally break the paralysis gripping the VIP gallery. The heavy glass door at the top of the stairs burst open, and Cynthia came rushing down into the boardroom. She was moving with a frantic, uncoordinated desperation, the heavy diamond necklace bouncing wildly against her chest. Her perfectly manicured facade was completely shattered. She pushed past the stunned board members and ran directly toward me, her face streaked with tears and twisted into a mask of absolute panic. She reached out with shaking, trembling hands, desperately trying to physically grab my arm, trying to utilize the physical affection that had once bound me to her. "Harrison, please!" Cynthia cried out, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek that grated against my ears. "You have to stop this. I am so sorry. I was completely manipulated. Gregory brainwashed me. He told me you were going to ruin us financially. We can fix this, Harrison. We can start over. We still have our home. We still have the house in the suburbs." I looked down at her grasping hands and took a deliberate, measured step backward, refusing to let her toxic touch soil my clothing. I looked at her weeping, desperate face and I smiled. It was a freezing, dead smile utterly devoid of any human warmth or forgiveness. "You mean the massive, sprawling suburban house that Derek illegally mortgaged for $1 million?" I asked softly, my voice laced with a lethal, quiet intensity. "The house you so eagerly fought to claim sole ownership of during our uncontested divorce proceedings." Cynthia froze, her tear-filled eyes widening as the terrifying realization began to dawn on her. V-Core Group bought that massive toxic debt yesterday afternoon. "Cynthia," I explained, delivering the final lethal strike with surgical precision. "And because your beloved son completely drained those accounts to fund Gregory's offshore empire, you are currently in massive unrecoverable default." I leaned in, slightly lowering my voice so only she and her sobbing son could hear the absolute finality of their destruction. "You legally assumed total liability for that property, and you have absolutely zero capital to satisfy the outstanding note. You and your treacherous son have exactly 24 hours to permanently vacate my property before the county sheriff arrives to forcefully evict you onto the street. You wanted to discard me and walk away a wealthy, independent woman. Congratulations on your complete independence. Have a nice life in the slums, Cynthia." I turned my back on her weeping form and walked slowly toward the towering windows that overlooked the bustling city plaza far below. The heavy soundproof glass completely muted the chaotic noise of the downtown traffic, creating a serene, silent viewing gallery for the final act of my meticulously engineered orchestration. Victor Cross stood silently beside me, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, projecting the absolute unwavering loyalty of a true operative. We looked down at this concrete plaza just as the heavy glass doors of the Apex Dynamics lobby violently swung open. A highly coordinated team of federal agents marched forcefully out into the bright morning sunlight, aggressively dragging their high-profile prisoners directly behind them. Gregory Thorne, the man who had arrogantly declared himself the undisputed king of the financial world just 30 minutes prior, was now stumbling awkwardly across the pavement. His incredibly expensive jacket was severely wrinkled and pulled taut across his shoulders by the freezing steel handcuffs binding his wrists. The aggressive corporate swagger he had weaponized against his terrified board of directors was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked stumble as the federal agents guided him toward the waiting tactical vehicles. Right behind him, my own treacherous son emerged into the unforgiving light of the day. Derek was openly weeping, his face buried deep into his chest, as he desperately tried to hide from the rapidly gathering crowd of curious onlookers and corporate employees. The grim federal agents did not offer him a single ounce of human dignity. They shoved him roughly toward the secondary transport vehicle, his expensive designer shoes scuffing violently against the unforgiving concrete. He had willfully sacrificed his fundamental family loyalty, his personal ethics, and his own father for a fleeting, imaginary illusion of immense power. Now he was trading his tailored suits for a federal prison uniform, completely embarking on a miserable journey into the absolute darkest depths of the criminal justice system. I watched with a cold, flawlessly calculating detachment as the agents placed their hands firmly on their heads and forcefully shoved both defeated men into the dark caged interiors of the transport vehicles. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive, absolute finality that echoed all the way up to my silent vantage point. A brief moment later, Cynthia practically tumbled out of the revolving lobby doors, desperately fighting to maintain her balance on her ridiculously high heels. She had not been formally arrested, but her ultimate inevitable punishment was arguably far more severe. The busy federal agents had completely ignored her frantic, hysterical pleas for mercy, leaving her entirely isolated on the public sidewalk. She stood trembling on the concrete pavement, clutching her absurdly expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest, as if it were a fragile life preserver in a raging ocean. The glittering diamonds fastened around her neck and strapped across her wrists felt like heavy mocking shackles, now that the offshore accounts funding them were completely frozen and actively seized. I watched her scream desperately at the rapidly departing black vehicles, her perfectly manicured facade entirely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The flashing red and blue lights of the convoy reflected briefly against the glass building as they pulled away, leaving her utterly alone in a cold world she no longer possessed the financial resources to navigate. She had exactly 24 hours before the county sheriff arrived to forcefully drag her out of the massive suburban mansion she had eagerly stolen. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The deep wounds of betrayal had completely healed thoroughly, replaced by the impenetrable, hardened armor of my own resurrected, unyielding dignity. I turned quietly away from the window, leaving the pathetic figure of my former wife far behind me. I nodded silently to Victor Cross, fully acknowledging the flawless perfection of his operational execution. Without speaking a single word, I walked out of the completely silent glass boardroom. The remaining corporate executives parted, instantly clearing my path without hesitation, their eyes wide with a profound, terrified reverence for the man who now held their professional destinies firmly in the palm of his hand. I did not acknowledge their presence. I walked slowly down the long, immaculately carpeted corridor, confidently stepping into the private executive elevator and pressing the glowing silver button for the main ground floor. The smooth descent was completely silent, isolating, and profoundly liberating. When the heavy elevator doors finally slid open, I walked purposefully across the polished marble lobby and pushed directly through the main exit doors. The crisp, exceptionally cool morning air hit my face, carrying the vibrant electric energy of the rapidly waking city. A pristine midnight black Maybach was parked exactly at the curb, its massive engine idling with a deep, incredibly comforting purr. A uniformed driver immediately stepped out onto the sidewalk, seamlessly opening the rear passenger door with a highly respectful, crisp bow. I slid smoothly into the luxurious leather interior, letting the thick, armored doors close firmly and completely seal out the chaotic, meaningless noise of the outside world. I settled back into the plush seat and looked calmly out the dark, tinted window. I did not look back at the towering corporate monolith or the totally shattered, ruined remnants of my former family. The $510 million resting securely in my heavily encrypted trust accounts could never ever buy back the 40 years I had foolishly wasted on absolute traitors. It could not magically erase the countless sacrifices I had made, or the sleepless nights I had aggressively labored to provide them with an incredibly privileged life. But it had successfully purchased my ultimate, uncompromising dignity, and it had flawlessly financed the absolute, total destruction of my enemies. The complex, violent chessboard was finally completely cleared. I pressed the sleek intercom button connecting directly to the front cabin. "Take me directly to the private airfield," I instructed the driver smoothly. "It is finally time for me to permanently leave this entire city far behind me." The heavy luxury vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging effortlessly into the endless flow of fast city traffic. A completely new, unburdened life was finally waiting for me over the distant horizon, shining like a beacon of absolute triumph, complete liberation, and victory. True character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in the dark corridors of vulnerability. When people believe you have nothing left to offer, they will show you exactly who they are. Do not let loyalty blind you to betrayal, and never allow shared history to justify ongoing abuse. Respect yourself enough to walk away in silence, gather your strength in the shadows, and let your success be the ultimate judge. The greatest revenge is not born from screaming matches or violent outbursts, but from absolute cold consequence. Age is not a weakness. It is the ultimate weapon of patience. Did Harrison handle this betrayal perfectly, or would you have done something differently? Drop your thoughts and your city in the comments below. If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our next satisfying revenge story.